Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. The following haunting took place in Plant Avenue, Webster Groves, Missouri. It was a two-story house that was set back from the road and was surrounded by a garden. The house was built in the late 19th century by a man called Mr. Jem, who eventually died in the house in the 1950s. In 1956, a family by the name of Furry moved in, and they had two young daughters. The family had not long moved into the house when Mrs. Fury started to experience strange events, such as being awakened night after night at exactly 2 a.m. in the morning, where she felt she was being shaken awake. On one occasion, she heard what sounded like a hammer hitting the headboard on their bed, and after immediately turning on the light, found there was no indentation. This was followed by the sound of something beating against the window, but when she got up to look, found that there was nothing there. She then started to hear footsteps going up and down the stairs all day and night. The footsteps sounded like someone was running around looking for something but not finding it. Strangely, they always ended up in the upstairs landing. She did not initially tell her husband about what she'd been experiencing and feared he would think she was being hysterical. But when she eventually disclosed to him what had been happening, he said that he'd heard nothing and to just forget about it. However, a short time later at breakfast, he told her he'd been hearing some odd noises, but figured there'd be a logical explanation. The house was very old, so it was probably the house expanding and contracting, but Mrs. Fury was not happy with that explanation. Constantly hearing footsteps did not sound like the house expanding and contracting. Then Mr. Fury was awakened one night and saw a filmy white shape go through the door and into the hallway, where it then made its way into their daughter's room. He quickly jumped out of bed and raced into their room, but there was nothing to be seen. He put everything down to the reflection of car lights from the street. The strange events of the house did not force them to leave, and over the years they got used to it. However, they did become concerned at breakfast one morning when their 3-year-old daughter asked who the lady dressed in black was who kept coming into their room at night. The parents knew full well that no lady had ever come into the house, and they asked, "What lady?" "Well, the lady who's holding the hand of her little boy." Sometime later, she again complained about the lady in black, stating that she keeps trying to hit me with a broom, but it didn't hurt. This was too much for the family, and after 9 years, they decided to move out. The house did not remain vacant for very long, and in November 1965, a family by the name of Walsh decided to rent the house. The family had 2 children, Wendy 10 and Sandy 15. At first, the family found the house to be quiet and pleasant, but a short time later, Claire Walsh was alone in the kitchen preparing dinner, apart from their dog. It was 6:30 when she suddenly noticed the dog cringing in fear, and she looked around for the probable cause. She then looked up and saw a white cloud that was the shape and height of a human, and it floated in through the open door that led to the living room. The experience only lasted a few seconds, and she'd seen nothing like it in her life. Her first thought was that it was a ghost. There was no doubt about it. Claire was not at all frightened and had her suspicions, because on the first day in the house she'd sensed the presence, which she initially ignored, but now realised that her intuitive feelings were correct. She also believed she was psychic and recalled that when she was a child, her aunt had died, and she'd seen her apparition before any other family realised she had died. She eventually forgot about the apparition in the kitchen, and nothing more came of it, but it was in the evenings when things became active. Strange noises started to fill the halls and rooms, and in the darkness, Claire could feel various presences around the house. The feeling was not particularly pleasant, and she later decided to do a background check of the house. In February 1966, the neighbours invited them to dinner, and they asked her whether they found the house quiet. Claire then told them everything that had been happening since moving in, and the neighbours then looked at each other because they knew exactly what she'd been talking about. The neighbours were going to buy the house themselves, but were dissuaded by the neighbours across the road. Over time, Claire kept notes about the occurrences. Just like the previous tenants, the family started to hear footsteps going up to the attic and then pausing. On the morning of March 1st, 1966, Claire would find the attic door open, even though she'd closed it the previous night. It had become a routine. One morning, she closed the attic door as usual and then had breakfast. She later returned to the attic and found the attic door open again. She walked into a small room they'd only used for storage, where the furniture had been neatly stored. Upon entering, she found everything in disarray and had been moved. But who had moved the furniture? The following morning, she awoke to the sound of incessant footsteps in the hallway. Someone was walking up and down, but it was someone she could not see. She then felt the urge to open a drawer and pull out an old music box that had not worked for years. But when she lifted the lid, it started to play. Who fixed it? On March the 5th, she awoke from a deep sleep around 4 a.m. and headed downstairs. In the dining room, she found the door wide open, which she'd closed the night before. The drawer was open, and the teaspoons had been rearranged, but by who? On March the 6th, she was again awoken at 4 a.m. and found the drawer containing her underwear was open and her clothing had been dispersed. But by who? She remembered her daughter telling her that she had heard someone opening and closing the drawers on the dresser. On March the 8th, Claire was in the basement and her daughter was playing in the garden. She then heard a child running in the dining room and kitchen and figured it was her daughter and called out, but there was no reply. But when she went upstairs to investigate, the house was empty and her daughter was still in the garden. On Sunday morning, her husband was alone in the house and got up to make himself breakfast. He then heard the sound of a child running up the stairs and assumed it was his daughter. He then went upstairs to check, but there was no child to be seen. After a family discussion, they believed the house was haunted by at least 3 people. A few days later, Claire was in the basement doing the laundry, and a jumper that was hanging up suddenly floated down from the rafters, hanger and all, and landed at her feet. The windows were closed, and there was no breeze. The jumper appeared to come down in an arc, as if being guided by unseen hands. On March the 16th, she awoke and sensed she was not alone. She later went up to the attic and saw what looked like a child's writing on some dusty furniture, along with a small child's handprint, but it was definitely not her daughter's. She remembered a month earlier when she was alone at the house and heard a small child crying somewhere in the house. Early next morning, Claire heard someone calling a child in the attic, but who was it? She believed that a family from the past was unaware that many years had passed and the house was no longer theirs. At 5 a.m, she would hear a typewriter, and that night as the family were dining in the kitchen, lights were suddenly turned on in the living room. The dog slowly became neurotic and fearful. The family eventually moved, as they'd had enough.